Here's William Lane Craig to try to convince us that non-physical entities are a coherent concept.
Christians believe that God is a non-physical being.
Already we have a self-contradictory assertion. What does it mean to say that something exists if it doesn't exist physically? What's the alternative? What is non-physical existence?
When Jesus affirmed God is spirit, he used the Greek word pneuma, which refers to an immaterial, unembodied agent, an invisible, personal mind.
That's a contradiction too. A mind is a physical process carried out by a physical system. That's why I also don't think souls or ghosts make any sense. The mind is a set of actions, specifically sensing, feeling, thinking, etc. In order for the mind to exist, something has to carry out these actions. What would it mean for something non-physical to carry out any kind of action? What would be an example of a non-physical action? And if there is some non-physical entity capable of carrying out these actions, why do we even need brains? What do brains do if it's actually a soul instead of the brain that carries out these cognitive actions? Why is it that making changes to the brain makes changes to the mind if the mind is not something that the brain does?
This concept of God is corroborated by perfect being theology. The starting point for this line of reasoning is that God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. As such, he has properties that make him great.
I can't conceive of a being that is a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, as Craig often describes God. To say that something exists or is a being is to say that it has location in space-time. To say that something exists independent of space-time is to say that it exists nowhere and never. In other words, it is to say that it does not exist. The greatest being of which I could conceive would have to be a spatio-temporal being. A timeless, spaceless being is not a conceivable being at all, let alone the greatest conceivable being.
Take, for example, knowledge. Clearly, a being that knows all truths is greater than a being who knows only some truths.
That depends on what you mean by greater. Also, by this standard, Jesus is not the greatest conceivable being because Jesus was not omniscient. He said that he didn't know when the end times were coming. An excuse that Craig has made for this is that Jesus' unconscious mind knew. I find this silly because there is no scriptural support for it. It's completely non-falsifiable. And if you don't know something consciously, you don't know it in any way that is distinguishable from not knowing it, making the distinction meaningless.
So a perfect being, God, must be all-knowing. But what does God's omniscience have to do with the idea that he is non-physical? Well, a physical object like a brain would have to be infinite in size and complexity to be the seat of infinite knowledge.
And something non-physical would be incapable of storing any information whatsoever. An all-knowing being would have to be a physical one. Information is simply a non-random pattern. In order for a non-random pattern to exist or be stored, there must be something arranged in that pattern. How do you arrange something non-physical into a pattern?
And clearly, there are no material objects that fit that description. So, if God is all-knowing, then he must be non-physical.
On the contrary, something has to be physical to contain any information at all.
We could also look at God's power. A being that is all-powerful is greater than a being who has limited power. So, a perfect being must be all-powerful.
In that case as well, such a being could not be non-physical, because what would it mean for something non-physical to have the power to do anything? It's not clear what it means for something non-physical to exist, let alone carry out any conceivable act. Insofar as non-physical means that something lacks location in space-time, it lacks existence, and thus lacks any power at all.
But for a physical being to be all-powerful, it would have to have infinite size and energy. And evidently, there are no material things like that.
Nor are there, or could there even conceivably be, any immaterial things like that.
So, if God is all-powerful, then he must be non-physical.
How could a non-physical being, which lacks the physical property of having energy, have any power at all, let alone all power?
In addition to theological reasons, we also have good philosophical and scientific evidence for the existence of a non-physical creator of the universe.
How could you possibly have scientific evidence of that which is non-physical? Bertrand Russell once defined physical, in his essay The Relation of Sense Data to Physics, as that which is dealt with by physics. To say that physics, or any of the other empirical sciences which are just higher levels of abstraction from physics, provides evidence of the non-physical is therefore a contradiction.
For example, the Kalam cosmological argument proposes that everything that begins to exist requires a cause.
That's not a scientific claim, it's a philosophical one, and it doesn't even make sense philosophically. If it is the case that time began to exist, for example, that would mean that time had a cause. It would be nonsensical for time to have a cause because you can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists. And there was obviously never a time when time itself didn't already exist, even if time does not stretch infinitely into the past.
Since the universe had a beginning, it requires a cause that is beyond the universe, beyond physical space and time.
Yeah, science points to none of this. I'm sure Craig is thinking that because science seems to show that time does not stretch infinitely into the past, all of this nonsensical stuff follows from that. It doesn't. It's not even recognizably coherent because beyond is a spatial orientation, and it is therefore a contradiction to say that anything is beyond space. You can't have a spatial orientation independent of space. But let's say that independent of space and time is all that Craig means by beyond. That still doesn't make sense because it means the same as saying that God exists nowhere and never.
And the creator of all matter and energy cannot himself be made of matter and energy. So the creator must be non-physical.
If he's not made of matter and energy, what is he made of? It doesn't seem like he has any substance at all. Here's ProfMTH to make this point much more eloquently.
Believers can tell one lots of things about what their God is not. For example, God is spirit. That is, God is not material, not physical. And they can provide a list of disembodied, secondary, and relational attributes. God is creator, the unmoved mover, father, those sorts of things. However, when it comes to providing a coherent, positive ontology of the God in whom believers claim to believe, whom they say atheists mistakenly deny, believers have nothing to offer. When pressed, many believers will say what that group of Christians I quoted before said, that is, the metaphysical structure of God is in fact outside our ability to know. Translation, we can't define what God is. Well, if you, believers, don't know what God is, then what are we talking about? What are you claiming the rest of us don't believe in? Every time a believer says that he or she is being asked to define the indefinable, he or she reinforces the fundamental problem. There is no coherent, positive ontology for this being that believers call God. The very object of the believer's faith cannot be defined in primary, positive, coherent terms.
Check out ProfMTH's channel, by the way. He hasn't uploaded in over a decade, but all of his videos are still great. I'll put a link to his video in the description.
Another argument, the fine-tuning argument, points out that the natural laws governing the material world include fundamental constants and quantities. These numbers are exquisitely fine-tuned for intelligent life. If any of these numbers varied by an infinitesimally small amount, there'd be no stars, no planets, no chemistry, and no intelligent life.
You clearly don't actually believe that because you believe that God is a form of intelligent life, and you believe that God's existence is not dependent on any universe at all, let alone a finely tuned one. Also, while the universe would be very different if these constants were different, we don't actually have any reason to believe that they were ever free to vary. The mere fact that we can imagine them being different doesn't mean that they ever actually could have been different. Thirdly, to assert that life would be impossible if these constants were different is to assert that your supposedly all-powerful God does not have the power to put life into a universe with even slightly different parameters. In fact, if we lived in a universe with a set of constants that made the natural development of life impossible, that would be far greater evidence that life is not a merely natural phenomenon.
Whoever fine-tuned the universe cannot himself be subject to these numbers, since he's the one who determined them in the first place.
And since he would be a form of intelligent life, it could not be the case that the existence of intelligent life is dependent upon these parameters.
So, it seems that whoever is behind it all is not part of the finely tuned material universe. The fine-tuner is non-physical.
That would only follow if we assume that this being existed not just independent of this universe, but also independent of any universe. It could rather be the case that he is a physical being who finely tuned this universe from some other universe. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.